Some men are meant to die alone, forgotten by the world they once called home. Jude Blackwood believed he was one of them until a desperate woman changed everything with 5 simple words. In 1878, Montana, 53-year-old Jude lives in a cabin he built with his own hands, miles from any town. His wife and 2 sons are buried under the pine trees out back. For 7 years, he's trapped beaver and hunted elk, letting the world pass him by. Then one October evening, a young woman named Ivy shows up at his door. She's pregnant, running from a violent man, and she makes him an offer. She needs a husband for protection, and he needs someone to carry on his name. It's not love she's offering. It's survival. But what happens when 2 broken people make a bargain that could save them both? Before we jump back in, tell us where you're tuning in from, and if this story touches you, make sure you're subscribed, because tomorrow I've saved something extra special for you. The morning ritual never changed. Jude Blackwood rose with the first grey light filtering through the single window of his cabin, his weathered hands automatically reaching for the coffee pot before his mind fully awakened. The floorboards, hewn from pine logs he'd felled himself, creaked under his weight, a sound that had become as familiar as his own heartbeat over the past 7 years. He moved through the motions with the precision of a man who had long ago surrendered to routine. Coffee grounds into the battered tin pot, water from the bucket by the door, kindling added to the banked coals in the stone fireplace. The flames caught and danced, casting shifting shadows across the cabin's interior. Walls chinked with mud and moss, shelves lined with preserved foods in mason jars, a single chair positioned before the hearth. Everything had its place in Jude's world, just as everything had its purpose. The rifle above the mantel, cleaned and oiled each Sunday. The traps hanging from wooden pegs, mended and ready for the season. The stack of pelts in the corner, waiting for his twice-yearly trip to the trading post in Willow Creek. 40 miles down the mountain, but it was the wedding ring that drew his attention each morning as he waited for the coffee to brew. The gold band, worn thin from years of wear, caught the firelight as he turned it on his finger. Sarah had slipped it there on a spring day in 1864, when the world was younger and full of promise, when their cabin echoed with laughter instead of silence, when small feet ran across these same floorboards. The ring was all that remained of those days, save for the 3 wooden crosses visible through the window. Standing sentinel beneath the towering pines, Jude poured his coffee and settled into his chair. The same chair where Sarah used to sit in the evenings, mending clothes while he whittled toys for the boys. The same chair where she'd rocked baby Thomas through his fever, singing lullabies in her soft voice. The same chair where she'd wept when the fever finally took him. Just shy of his 4th birthday, little James had lasted 2 more years before the riding accident. A simple fall from his pony that should have been nothing more than scraped knees and wounded pride. But the boy had struck his head on a boulder, and despite Sarah's desperate nursing, he'd never awakened. 6 years old, with his mother's green eyes and his father's stubborn streak, Sarah had followed them within the year, her heart simply unable to bear the weight of such loss. Jude had found her one morning, still and peaceful in their bed, her hand reaching toward the empty cradles that still sat in the corner of their room. That was 1871, 7 years of mornings just like this one. 7 years of coffee drunk in solitude, 7 years of conversations with ghosts and memories. The routine sustained him, gave shape to days that might otherwise blur together in an endless stream of meaningless time. After coffee came the morning inspection of his trap lines, following paths worn smooth by countless journeys through the dense forest. He knew every tree, every rock, every stream that wound through his territory. The mountains had become his world entire, bounded by ridges and valleys that stretched as far as a man could walk in a day. His nearest neighbor lived 15 miles south, an ancient prospector named Henrik, who ventured up the mountain perhaps 3 times a year to trade news for coffee and tobacco. The growing settlements of Willow Creek and Pine Ridge might as well have been on the other side of the earth, for all the relevance they held in Jude's daily existence. He preferred it that way. The world beyond his mountains was changing too rapidly, filling with people and noise and complications he no longer had the heart to navigate. Here, among the pines and granite peaks, life moved at a pace he could understand. Seasons turned, animals followed their ancient patterns, and a man could live according to rhythms older than civilization. His cabin reflected this philosophy. Built with his own hands during the early years of his marriage, it stood solid and square against the mountainside. Its thick log walls chinked tight against winter winds. The roof, steep-pitched to shed snow, was layered with hand-split shingles that had weathered to a silvered grey. A stone chimney rose from one end, built with rocks he'd quarried from the creek bed a half-mile away. Inside, the space was divided simply. The main room served as kitchen, sitting area and workshop, with Sarah's old rocking chair positioned to catch both the warmth of the fire and the light from the window. A ladder led to a small loft where he stored supplies and rarely used items. The bedroom, separated from the main room by a curtain Sarah had sewn from blue calico, contained little more than a bed, a chest of drawers, and those empty cradles he couldn't bring himself to move. Everything spoke of permanence, of a life built to last. The kitchen shelves held dishes Sarah had chosen, plates and cups that had witnessed countless family meals. The workbench near the window bore the marks of projects spanning years, furniture repaired, tools maintained, toys carved for children who would never play with them. Yet for all its solidity, the cabin felt hollow now, like an echo of the home it had once been. Too large for one man, too quiet for comfort. The silence had weight, pressing down on him during the long winter evenings, when wind howled through the pines and snow piled high against the walls. This October evening had started like all the others. He'd returned from checking his traps as the sun set behind the western peaks, painting the sky in shades of gold and crimson. His catch had been modest, 2 rabbits and a beaver, but sufficient for his needs. The beaver pelt would bring a fair price at the trading post, and the meat would supplement his winter stores. He'd cleaned his catch by lamplight, working with the methodical precision of long practice. The rabbits he'd skinned and quartered, wrapping the meat in oiled cloth before storing it in the cold cellar beneath the cabin floor. The beaver required more careful attention, its pelt valuable enough to warrant extra effort in the preparation. As always, he'd worked in silence, his movements economical and sure. There was satisfaction in such work, a connection to purposes older than memory. His grandfather had been a trapper, and his grandfather's father before him. The skills lived in his hands, passed down through generations of men who had made their living in wild places. By the time he'd finished, full darkness had settled over the mountains. He'd banked the fire, checked the door latch, habit more than necessity in this remote place, and prepared for another solitary evening. Perhaps he'd read from one of the few books that lined a shelf near his chair. Maybe he'd work on the harness he'd been mending, or simply sit and watch the flames dance in the fireplace. He'd poured himself a second cup of coffee, adding a splash of whiskey from the bottle he kept for such purposes. When the knock came, 3 soft raps, barely audible above the whisper of wind through the trees. Jude froze, cup halfway to his lips. In 7 years of solitude, no one had ever knocked on his door after dark. Hendrik announced himself with shouts long before reaching the cabin, and the occasional lost traveler invariably arrived during daylight hours. The knock came again, more insistent this time. Definitely human, definitely deliberate. Jude set down his cup and reached for the rifle, checking automatically that it was loaded before moving to the window. The glass, thick and wavy, revealed only darkness beyond the small circle of light cast by his lamp. "Who's there?" he called, his voice rusty from disuse. "Please," came a woman's voice, thin and strained. "I need help." Jude hesitated, every instinct honed by years of mountain living, screaming caution. Women didn't travel alone through these mountains, particularly not at night. Whatever had brought this one to his door promised complications he'd spent 7 years avoiding, but the voice held genuine desperation. And beneath his carefully cultivated solitude, Jude remained fundamentally decent. He'd never turned away anyone in genuine need, and he wasn't about to start now. He opened the door cautiously, rifle held ready, but not aimed. The sight that greeted him would have been shocking under any circumstances. In the flickering lamplight stood a young woman, perhaps 25 years of age, her dark hair hanging loose and tangled around her shoulders. Her dress, once blue but now stained with mud and worse things, hung in tatters. Dirt streaked her face, and her eyes held the wide, haunted look of prey that had run long and hard from predators. But it was her condition that struck him most forcefully. Even in the poor light, even through the concealing folds of her ruined dress, her pregnancy was unmistakable. "Ma'am," he said softly, lowering the rifle. "What in God's name brings you up here?" She swayed slightly, exhaustion evident in every line of her body. "I'm sorry to trouble you," she said, her voice carrying the cultured tones of education despite her bedraggled appearance. "I've been walking for 2 days. I saw your light. Walking. From where?" He stepped aside, gesturing her into the warmth of the cabin. Whatever her story, she needed shelter and food before anything else. "Pine Ridge," she said, stumbling slightly as she crossed the threshold. "I had to leave. I couldn't." Her voice broke and she wrapped her arms protectively around her swollen belly. Pine Ridge was 30 miles south through difficult terrain, most of it without any semblance of a trail. That a woman in her condition had managed such a journey spoke to either remarkable determination or absolute desperation. "Sit," Jude said, guiding her to Sarah's chair. "You look ready to fall over." She sank into the chair with a grateful sigh, and in the full light of the cabin, Jude could see the extent of her ordeal. Her hands were scratched and bleeding, her feet barely contained in shoes that had been reduced to little more than leather scraps. But it was the bruises on her face and neck that made his jaw tighten, old bruises, yellowed with age, that spoke of violence endured over time. "What's your name?" he asked, moving to the stove to heat water for tea. "Ivy," she said quietly. "Ivy Morrison." The surname meant nothing to him, but he filed it away nonetheless. "I'm Jude Blackwood. This is my place." She nodded, looking around the cabin with eyes that missed nothing, despite her exhaustion. "You live alone?" "I do." He brought her a cup of tea, watching as she wrapped her hands around it for warmth. "When's that baby due?" Color rose in her cheeks. "Soon, maybe 6 weeks." "And the father?" Her hands tightened on the cup. "That's complicated." Jude studied her face, reading the tension there. "I reckon most things are up here." "You running from someone?" For a long moment she didn't answer. Then slowly she nodded. "Sheriff Murdoch, in Pine Ridge. She stopped, pressing her lips together. "He what?" "He considers me his property," she said, the words coming out flat and hard. I disagreed with that assessment. There was steel beneath the exhaustion in her voice, a strength that impressed him despite himself. "Property," he repeated. "That's a strong word. It's an accurate one." She met his eyes directly. "He kept me like a thing he owned. When I tried to leave before, he made it clear what would happen if I tried again. But you tried anyway." "I had to." Her hand moved to her belly. "I won't raise a child in that situation." Jude poured himself another cup of coffee, his mind working through the implications. Sheriff Murdoch had a reputation even up here in the mountains, a man who used his badge to take what he wanted and punish anyone who stood in his way. If this woman had been under his protection or control, her escape would not go unanswered. "He'll come looking," he said. Yes, she didn't try to deny it. "Eventually, but this place is so remote and winter's coming. Maybe he'll give up, find someone else to—" "Men like that don't give up," Jude said quietly. "They just get angrier." She was quiet for a long moment, staring into the fire. "I know, but I had to try. I couldn't stay there, not with a child coming." "What about family? People who could help you?" "All gone." Her voice held the flatness that came with old grief. "Parents died of cholera when I was 16. I've been on my own since then, making my way as best I could. And that led you to Pine Ridge. I was working as a school teacher. Murdoch, Sheriff Murdoch, he took an interest. At first, it seemed like protection. A woman alone needs that in a place like Pine Ridge." She laughed bitterly. "I was naive." Jude understood the trap she described. Frontier towns were hard places for women without male protection, and men like Murdoch were skilled at identifying the vulnerable. "How long were you?" 2 years. She said it quickly, as if the words burned. 2 years of being his kept woman, his possession. He made sure everyone in town knew it, made sure I had nowhere else to go. And now you're here. She looked up at him, and he saw something shift in her expression. The desperation was still there, but beneath it was a calculation that surprised him. "Yes, I'm here and I need your help. Lady, I'm not sure what kind of help. Marry me." The words hung in the air between them, so unexpected that Jude wondered if he'd misheard. "What?" "I need a husband," she said, her voice steady now, as if she'd been rehearsing this speech. "Someone who can protect me from Murdoch, give my child a name. You need—" She paused, looking around the cabin again. "You need someone to care for you as you age, someone to carry on your legacy after you're gone." Jude stared at her, coffee cup forgotten in his hands. In all the possibilities he'd considered when he opened his door, this had not been among them. "Ma'am Ivy, you don't know what you're saying. You're tired, scared. I know exactly what I'm saying." She leaned forward, her eyes intense. "I'm not offering love, Mr. Blackwood. I'm offering partnership, survival, for both of us. You don't even know me. I know you live alone in a place that takes considerable skill to survive. I know you opened your door to a stranger in need. I know you haven't thrown me back out into the night, even after I told you I'd bring trouble to your door." She paused. "I know you understand what it means to lose people you love." The last words hit harder than she could have intended. Jude's gaze drifted involuntarily to the window, where the 3 crosses stood barely visible in the darkness. "How could you possibly know that? The cradle's in the corner. The woman's rocking chair. The way you move through this space, like you're trying not to disturb ghosts." Her voice softened. "I know grief, Mr. Blackwood. I recognize it in others." For a long moment neither of them spoke. The fire crackled in the hearth, and wind whispered through the pines outside. Finally, Jude set down his cup and looked at her directly. "Even if I was inclined to consider such an arrangement, and I'm not saying I am, you're talking about bringing a baby into this. Winters here are hard. The nearest doctor is 40 miles away. If something went wrong, something's already gone wrong," she said quietly. "I'm here because every other option has been taken from me. This baby will be born, whether it's in a cabin on a mountain or in a back room above Murdoch's saloon. At least here, it would be born free." The simple dignity in her voice made something twist in Jude's chest. He found himself studying her face, looking past the exhaustion and fear to the woman beneath. She was younger than Sarah had been when they married, but there was an old soul quality to her eyes, a hardness earned through experience he could only imagine. "You said this was about partnership," he said slowly. "What exactly are you proposing?" "A marriage of convenience. I keep house, help with the work, care for you as you age. You give my child a name and protection from men like Murdoch. When you die, the child inherits whatever legacy you leave behind. And between us—" Color rose in her cheeks again. "Whatever develops naturally, if anything. I won't force affection where none exists, and I hope you wouldn't either." It was a practical arrangement, the kind of bargain that had been struck countless times on the frontier, where survival often mattered more than sentiment. But it had been 7 years since Jude had contemplated sharing his life with anyone. 7 years since he'd considered the possibility that his story might include more than simply waiting to join Sarah and the boys beneath the pines. "I need to think," he said finally. She nodded, understanding in her eyes. "Of course, but Mr. Blackwood, I can't stay in Pine Ridge. If you decide against this, I'll have to keep moving, find somewhere else to go. And winter's coming." The implication was clear. In her condition, with winter approaching and limited options, rejection here might well be a death sentence. The weight of that knowledge settled on his shoulders like a familiar burden. "You can stay the night," he said. "Sleep by the fire, rest up. We'll talk more in the morning. Thank you." Relief flooded her voice. "I know this is a lot to ask of a stranger." "It is," he agreed. "But I reckon desperate times call for desperate measures." He found blankets and a pillow, making a comfortable pallet near the hearth. As she settled down to sleep, he retreated to his bedroom, but sleep proved elusive. He lay staring at the ceiling, his mind churning through the implications of her proposition. Marriage. After 7 years of solitude, 7 years of mourning, the word felt foreign on his tongue. But as he listened to her quiet breathing from the main room, he found himself considering not just the practical aspects of her proposal, but the deeper questions it raised. What kind of legacy was he leaving? When he died, and at 53, that eventuality seemed less distant than it once had. What would remain of Jude Blackwood? An empty cabin, eventually reclaimed by the forest. A few stories told by Henrik to anyone who would listen. A worn trail through the mountains that would disappear within a few seasons. The ring on his finger caught moonlight from the window. Sarah would have wanted him to be happy, he knew that. She'd said as much during her final illness, making him promise not to spend his life mourning her memory. But knowing what she would have wanted and being able to act on it were different things entirely. Outside, an owl called from the darkness, its voice lonely and questioning. Jude closed his eyes and tried to imagine what the morning would bring, what answer he would give the desperate woman sleeping by his fire. The decision would change everything, he knew that much. The quiet rhythms of his mountain existence would be disrupted, replaced by complications he'd spent 7 years avoiding. But perhaps, he thought, as sleep finally began to claim him, some complications were worth accepting. Perhaps some forms of salvation came, disguised as desperate women knocking on doors in the middle of the night. The thought followed him into dreams filled with voices he'd thought forgotten and futures he'd never dared to imagine. Dawn crept slowly over the mountain peaks, painting the sky in soft shades of pink and gold. Jude woke to the familiar sounds of his cabin, settling in the morning cold. But today, something was different. The quiet breathing from the main room reminded him that his solitude had been broken, perhaps permanently. He dressed quietly and slipped out the back door to tend to his morning needs and check on the animals. The 3 wooden crosses caught the early light, standing patient and solemn among the pines. For a moment he paused before them, his hand instinctively moving to the wedding ring on his finger. "What do you think, Sarah?" he whispered to the still air. "What would you have me do?" The only answer was the rustle of wind through the branches overhead. But somehow the sound seemed less lonely than usual. When he returned to the cabin, Ivy was awake, sitting up on her makeshift bed and attempting to smooth her tangled hair. In the morning light, he could see more clearly the extent of her ordeal. Her dress was not just torn, but deliberately ripped in places, as if someone had grabbed at the fabric with violent intent. Dark stains that might have been blood marked the bodice, and the fabric around her wrists was frayed as if she'd been bound. "Good morning," she said softly, her voice hoarse from exhaustion. "I hope I didn't disturb your sleep." "You didn't." Jude moved to the stove, beginning his morning routine of starting the fire and preparing coffee. "How are you feeling?" "Better. Rested." She struggled to her feet, one hand pressed to her lower back. "Mr. Blackwood, about last night, I know my proposal was unexpected. If you've decided against it, I understand. I shouldn't have presumed." "Hold on," he said, holding up a hand. "Let's get some food in you before we talk about anything else. When's the last time you ate?" She considered this. 2 days ago, maybe 3. There was a farmhouse. The woman gave me some bread and milk when I told her I was traveling to visit family." Jude's jaw tightened. 3 days without proper food, in her condition, after walking 30 miles through mountain terrain. Whatever had driven her from Pine Ridge, it must have been severe indeed to risk such hardship. He prepared a simple breakfast of eggs from his chickens, bacon from his smokehouse, and biscuits left over from the previous day. As he worked, he found himself stealing glances at her. Without the desperate exhaustion of the previous night, he could see more clearly the woman beneath the ordeal. She was indeed young, probably no more than 25 as he'd guessed, with dark hair that would be beautiful when clean and cared for. Her hands, though scratched and dirty, were slender and graceful, the hands of someone accustomed to finer work than manual labor. but it was her eyes that drew his attention. Despite her youth, they held depths that spoke of experiences no woman should have to endure. When she thought he wasn't looking, her expression would turn inward, haunted by memories that still held power over her. "Here," he said, setting a full plate before her. "Eat slowly. Your stomach won't be used to rich food." She nodded and began eating with careful restraint, though he could see the effort it took not to devour the meal. Her manners were refined despite her circumstances, confirming his suspicion that she'd been raised with some advantages before whatever path had led her to Pine Ridge and Sheriff Murdoch. "Tell me about him," Jude said, settling across from her with his own plate. "Murdoch," her fork paused halfway to her mouth. "Why?" "Because if I'm considering your proposal, I need to know what kind of danger you're bringing to my door." She set down her fork and looked directly at him. "The worst kind. Sheriff Murdoch isn't just a lawman who abuses his authority. He's a man who believes the world exists for his pleasure. Women, especially, exist only to serve his needs, and I was his latest acquisition." The words came out clipped and hard. "When I arrived in Pine Ridge to take the teaching position, I thought I was fortunate to have the sheriff's protection. A single woman in a frontier town needs that, or so everyone told me." She stood and walked to the window, her arms wrapped protectively around herself. "At first it seemed innocent enough. He'd escort me to and from the schoolhouse, make sure the rougher elements in town knew I was under his watch. I was grateful. When did it change?" "Gradually. He began expecting me to have dinner with him at the hotel. Then he insisted I needed better lodging, a room above the saloon where he could keep a closer eye on me. Before I knew it, I wasn't allowed to leave without his permission. Other men in town wouldn't even look at me, much less speak to me. I was his, whether I'd agreed to it or not." Jude felt a familiar anger building in his chest, the same rage he'd felt during the war when he'd witnessed the strong preying on the weak. "How long before he forced himself on you?" She flinched at the blunt question, but answered with the same directness. 6 months. By then, I was completely isolated. He'd made it clear to everyone that I belonged to him, and he'd made it equally clear to me what would happen if I tried to resist or run. "He hurt you?" "Yes." She turned from the window, and he could see the shadows of old bruises on her throat. Not enough to mark me where others could see, but enough to make his point. "I learned to comply, to smile when he wanted me to smile, to play the role of the grateful woman under his protection. And the baby?" "His, obviously." "When I told him, he was pleased. Said it proved I belonged to him completely now. That I could never leave because no decent man would want another man's leavings, especially carrying his bastard." The casual cruelty in the words made Jude's hands clench into fists. "But you tried to leave anyway." "Not at first. For months I told myself it could be worse. I had food, shelter, safety of a sort. The baby would be born with some measure of protection." She returned to her chair, her movements careful and deliberate. "But then I realized what kind of life that would be for a child. Growing up knowing their mother was nothing more than property, that violence was the natural order of things. So you ran. I planned it for weeks. Murdoch had been called away to the territorial capital on business, some kind of hearing about his conduct, though nothing would come of it. He left 2 of his men to watch me, but they were lazy and drunk most of the time." She pulled up her sleeve, revealing rope burns around her wrists. "I waited until they were both passed out, then worked free of the ropes they used to tie me to the bed at night. I took what food I could carry, some clothes, and left through the back window. In your condition, 30 miles through the mountains. I know it was dangerous, but staying was more dangerous. For me and for the baby." Her hand moved protectively to her belly. "I couldn't let a child grow up thinking that was normal, that women exist to be used and discarded at men's pleasure." Jude studied her face, seeing the steel beneath the exhaustion. This was not a woman who had run from a bad situation on impulse. This was someone who had carefully weighed her options and chosen the path that offered the best chance for her child's future. "Regardless of the cost to herself, he'll come after you," he said. "Yes. When he returns and finds me gone, he'll be furious. Men like Murdoch don't accept defiance, especially from women." He'll see it as a challenge to his authority, his reputation. And when he tracks you here, I don't know. For the first time since beginning her story, uncertainty crept into her voice. I thought maybe if I had a husband, a legitimate claim to protection. You thought wrong. Jude's voice was gentle but firm. A marriage certificate won't stop a man like that. If anything, it might make him angrier. Her face fell, hope draining away like water from a broken vessel. Then you won't— I didn't say that. He stood and walked to the mantel, his fingers tracing the stock of his rifle. But I need you to understand what you're asking. If I marry you, if I take on the responsibility of protecting you and your child, there's a good chance it'll come to violence. Are you afraid of him? Jude turned to meet her gaze. Ma'am, I've been afraid of better men than Sheriff Murdoch. But I've also buried better men than him. When the situation called for it, something shifted in her expression. Surprise, perhaps, or a reassessment of the quiet mountain man she'd taken for a simple trapper. You were a soldier, among other things. He returned to his chair, suddenly feeling the weight of old memories. The point is, if I agree to this arrangement, I'm not just taking on a wife and child. I'm taking on a war, I know. And I know it's not fair to ask that of you, but I don't have anywhere else to go, anyone else to turn to. Her voice broke slightly. I'm not asking you to love me, Mr. Blackwood. I'm asking you to give my child a chance at a life that doesn't involve growing up in the shadow of violence and degradation. The desperation in her voice tore at something deep in his chest. He thought of his own sons, of the dreams he and Sarah had harbored for their futures. He thought of the empty cradles in his bedroom, waiting for children who would never fill them again. What kind of wife would you be? He asked quietly. In practical terms, I mean. I can cook, clean, mend clothes. I know some basic medicine, enough to treat common ailments and injuries. I can read and write, keep accounts if needed. I'm not afraid of hard work, and I learn quickly. She paused. I won't be a burden, Mr. Blackwood. I'll earn my place here, and when the child comes, I'll raise it to be respectful, hard-working, grateful for the protection and name you've given it. Boy or girl, they'll know you as their father and honor you as such. It was a practical answer to a practical question, but Jude found himself wondering about the deeper implications. What would it mean to raise another man's child, especially one conceived in violence and fear? Could he come to love such a child as his own? The thought surprised him with its possibility. Perhaps the capacity for fatherhood wasn't something that died with one's own children. Perhaps it was simply waiting, dormant, for the right circumstances to reawaken it. I need time to think, he said finally. This isn't a decision to make lightly. Of course. Relief flooded her voice, not because he'd agreed, but because he hadn't yet refused. How long? Give me the day. I'll have an answer for you this evening. She nodded, understanding that this was the best offer she was likely to receive. What should I do in the meantime? Rest, recover your strength. If you're feeling up to it, there are some women's clothes in the bedroom chest that might fit you. My wife was about your size. The offer of his deceased wife's clothing was a gesture of trust, and they both recognized it as such. Ivy's eyes filled with tears. She quickly blinked away. Thank you, she whispered, for everything. Whatever you decide, you've already shown me more kindness than I've known in 2 years. Jude nodded and rose from the table. I'll be checking my trap lines. Help yourself to whatever you need. He left her sitting by the fire. The torn and bloodied dress, the artifact of her violent escape, a stark reminder of the life she was fleeing and the choice that lay before him. As he walked into the forest, following paths worn smooth by years of solitary journeys, he found himself contemplating not just the practical aspects of her proposal, but the deeper question it raised. After 7 years of existing rather than living, was he ready to rejoin the world of the living? Was he prepared to exchange the safety of his grief for the dangerous possibility of hope? The mountain offered no easy answers, but as the sun climbed higher in the autumn sky, Jude Blackwood began to understand that some decisions couldn't be made with the mind alone. Some required the heart to take risks that logic would never approve. Some required a leap of faith into an uncertain future, guided only by the belief that even broken people deserved a chance at redemption. The mountain silence that had once brought Jude peace now felt heavy with unspoken questions. As he walked his traplines, checking each snare with practiced efficiency, his mind wrestled with Ivy's proposal. The familiar rhythm of his work, the careful approach to each trap, the quick assessment of success or failure, the methodical resetting usually provided a meditative calm. Today, it offered no respite from the turmoil in his thoughts. He found 2 rabbits in his snares, their deaths clean and quick. As he reset the traps, he couldn't help but think about the parallels between predator and prey, about the various forms of hunting that shaped life in wild places. Sheriff Murdoch was a predator of a different sort, one who used law and authority as his snares. Ivy had been caught, but somehow she'd managed to chew through the rope and escape. Now she was offering herself to another trap, albeit one of her own choosing. The question was whether Jude was the kind of man who would accept such an arrangement, and what it would make him if he did. When he returned to the cabin near midday, he found Ivy transformed. She had washed in the basin by the window, her dark hair now clean and braided neatly down her back. She wore one of Sarah's dresses, a simple brown wool that fit her well despite her pregnancy. The sight of another woman in his wife's clothing should have felt like sacrilege, but instead it seemed somehow right, as if Sarah's things were being given new purpose rather than simply gathering dust. "I hope you don't mind," Ivy said, smoothing the skirt self-consciously. "My own dress was beyond saving. It suits you." He hung his rifle on its pegs and moved to wash his hands. "You look rested. I feel human again." She had prepared a simple lunch, bread, cheese and tea, and set it on the table. "I found your root cellar. You're well prepared for winter. 7 years of living alone teaches a man to be self-sufficient." He sat across from her, noting how naturally she had fallen into the domestic routine. "You move around the kitchen like you know what you're doing. I kept house for my parents until they died, then for myself afterward. It's not difficult work when you're doing it by choice rather than compulsion." She poured tea for both of them, her movements graceful despite her condition. "Mr. Blackwood, I've been thinking about what I said last night, about marriage and partnership, and I realize I may have sounded calculating, reducing everything to practical arrangements. I want you to know that's not—" She paused, searching for words. "I'm not incapable of affection. What I experienced with Murdoch hasn't destroyed that part of me entirely. I simply don't want you to feel obligated to pretend feelings that don't exist." Jude studied her face, seeing the vulnerability beneath her careful composure. "What are you saying?" "I'm saying that if we do this, I'd like us to be honest with each other. If friendship develops, wonderful. If something deeper grows over time, I wouldn't be opposed to it. But I won't pretend to love you simply because you've given me shelter. And I hope you won't feel obligated to pretend the same." It was a mature perspective, one that spoke to hard-won wisdom about the nature of relationships. "You've given this considerable thought." "I had 3 days of walking to think about very little else." She smiled slightly, the first genuine expression of warmth he'd seen from her. "A woman in my position can't afford to be romantic about these things. But that doesn't mean I want a cold arrangement either. What do you want?" "Partnership, as I said. Mutual respect. The possibility of friendship, maybe more if it develops naturally." She met his eyes directly. "I want my child to grow up in a home where people treat each other with kindness, even if they don't share passionate love." The simple dignity of her answer impressed him. "And if I decide against this, then I'll thank you for your kindness and move on. I won't impose on your hospitality longer than necessary." "Where would you go?" "I don't know. Further west, perhaps. California, if I can make it that far before the baby comes." Her hand moved instinctively to her belly. "It's not an ideal plan, but I've survived worse odds." Jude doubted that, but he admired her determination not to become a burden. "Show me what else you can do," he said. "Around the place, I mean. If we're talking about partnership, I need to know what kind of partner you'd be." Relief flickered in her eyes. not because he'd agreed, but because he was taking her seriously enough to investigate the practical aspects.
What would you like to see?
He spent the afternoon showing her around his property, explaining his systems and routines while observing her responses. She asked intelligent questions about his root cellar storage methods, examined his smokehouse with professional interest, and demonstrated her knowledge of preserving food for winter. When they reached his small vegetable garden, now mostly harvested for the season, she knelt carefully to examine the soil and remaining plants. "You've got good drainage here, and the southern exposure is perfect," she said, pulling a few late carrots from the ground. "With some planning, you could expand this considerably. Root vegetables, beans, squash, enough to reduce your dependence on hunting and trading. You know, farming. My father had a small farm before he moved the family to town for business opportunities. I learned the basics." She brushed soil from the carrots, her movements practiced. "A larger garden would mean better nutrition, especially important if there's going to be a child here." They moved on to his workshop, where she examined his tools and the various projects in different stages of completion. She picked up a piece of leather he'd been working on, a harness that needed intricate stitching, and ran her fingers along the partially completed seams. "This is beautiful work," she said. "Very precise, may I?" He handed her the leather punch and all, watching as she continued the pattern he'd started. Her stitches were small and even, her technique sure, despite the awkwardness of working around her pregnancy. "Where did you learn leather work?" "My father made saddles and harnesses before he tried his hand at other businesses. He taught me the basics, said a person never knew when practical skills might be needed." She set down the tools and flexed her fingers. "I'm out of practice, but it comes back quickly." As they walked back toward the cabin, Jude found himself mentally cataloging her abilities. Cooking, cleaning, basic medicine, farming, leatherwork, reading and writing. She was considerably more skilled than most frontier women, certainly more than most women in her desperate circumstances would be expected to be. "You're not what I expected," he said as they reached the porch. "What did you expect? Someone more fragile, I suppose. Someone broken by what she'd been through." "I am broken," she said quietly, "but not destroyed. There's a difference." Inside the cabin, she began preparing dinner without being asked, moving around his kitchen with increasing familiarity. As she worked, she spoke about practical matters, where things were stored, how his systems could be improved, what additional supplies might be needed if another person were to live here permanently. "You have most of what's needed," she said, stirring a pot of stew she'd made from vegetables and preserved meat. "But winter clothing for a woman, additional bedding, medical supplies for the birth, those would be necessities. The nearest town with a proper general store is 40 miles. "I know. I'd need to make a list, plan carefully. One trip would have to suffice." She paused in her stirring. "Assuming, of course, that you decide this arrangement makes sense." As they ate dinner, Jude found himself studying not just her words but her entire manner. She was comfortable with domestic work but not subservient. She offered opinions without being pushy, showed initiative without overstepping bounds she couldn't yet define. Most importantly, she seemed genuinely interested in partnership rather than simply seeking a protector. "There's something I need to show you," he said after they finished eating. He led her to the bedroom, where Sarah's cedar chest sat at the foot of the bed. The wood was smooth and dark with age, carved with roses his wife had traced herself when they were young and planning their future together. Inside, wrapped carefully in tissue paper, lay Sarah's wedding dress, cream silk with tiny pearl buttons, preserved with lavender and cedar shavings. "She wore this when we married," he said, his voice rough with memory. 16 years old, prettiest thing I'd ever seen. Insisted on white silk, even though we were living in a cabin in the wilderness." Ivy touched the fabric gently, reverently. "It's beautiful." "She must have been lovely." "She was." He closed the chest carefully. "I've been thinking about your proposal all day. About what Sarah would want, what's right, what makes sense. And I think—" He stopped, suddenly uncertain. The words that would change both their lives forever seemed too weighty for casual utterance. "I think we should try it. The arrangement you proposed, Joy and relief flooded her face, quickly replaced by practical concern. "Are you certain? Once we do this, there's no taking it back. Murdoch will never stop looking for me, and you'll be involved whether you want to be or not. I'm certain." As he spoke the words, Jude realized they were true. For the first time in 7 years, he was choosing to move forward rather than simply enduring. "We'll need to make it legal as soon as possible. There's a circuit preacher who comes through Willow Creek once a month. If we can get word to him, Mr. Blackwood, Jude, thank you." Tears started in her eyes. "I promise you won't regret this. I'll be a good wife, a good partner. I'll earn my place here. I know you will." He found himself oddly moved by her gratitude, by the simple fact that his decision could mean so much to another person. "We'll make it work, Ivy. Whatever comes, we'll face it together." As they prepared for sleep, she by the fire, he in his solitary bedroom, Jude reflected on the strange turns his life had taken. Yesterday he had been a man waiting to die. Tonight he was a man preparing to become a husband and father again. The transformation felt both terrifying and oddly liberating. For 7 years he had existed in a state of suspended animation, neither fully alive nor completely dead. Now, with a simple yes to a desperate woman's proposal, he had chosen to rejoin the land of the living, whatever the cost, whatever the consequences. Jude Blackwood was ready to discover what came next. The next morning brought the first frost of the season. Silver crystals coating the pine needles and turning the meadow grass brittle underfoot. Jude woke to find Ivy already up, tending the fire and preparing coffee with the quiet efficiency of someone accustomed to early rising. She had braided her hair differently, he noticed, a practical style that would stay neat during work. "Good morning," she said softly, not wanting to wake him if he'd still been sleeping. "I hope the fire didn't disturb you. You're up early." He pulled on his boots and jacket, noting how natural it felt to have another person moving about his cabin in the morning. 7 years of solitude hadn't prepared him for how quickly he could adapt to companionship, old habit. When you're dependent on someone else's moods and schedules, you learn to be ready before they expect you to be. She handed him a cup of coffee, their fingers brushing briefly in the exchange. "What needs doing today?" It was a simple question, but it marked a fundamental shift in how Jude thought about his daily routine. For years, each day had been structured around his needs alone, his trap lines, his hunting, his maintenance tasks. Now he found himself considering what we needed to accomplish rather than what I had planned. "There's firewood to split and stack," he said, settling into his chair. "Winter's coming fast, and we'll need more than I usually cut for one person. The roof over the back room needs some attention before the snow flies. And if we're serious about expanding the garden next spring, there's ground to clear and prepare. I can help with most of that." She sat across from him, cradling her own cup for warmth. "Maybe not the roof work, given my condition, but the rest I can manage." Over breakfast, they discussed the practical details of merging their lives. Ivy would need winter clothing, as she'd mentioned, but also personal items that would make the cabin feel like home rather than simply shelter. They would need to establish routines that accommodated both her pregnancy and the increased workload of supporting 2 people through a mountain winter. "There's something I've been working on," Jude said, finishing his eggs. "Something I started years ago but never finished. Come with me." He led her to his workshop, moving aside some stored lumber to reveal a half-completed cradle. The wood was seasoned pine, carefully selected and smooth-sanded, with intricate carved details along the sides, bears and eagles, mountain flowers and pine branches. It was clearly the work of skilled hands and considerable time. Sivy drew in a sharp breath, her hand moving instinctively to her belly. "You made this?" "Started it for—" He cleared his throat, old grief catching his words. "For my sons, when Sarah was expecting Thomas, then again when James was on the way. Never could bring myself to finish it after. She ran her fingers along the carved bears, tracing the detail with obvious appreciation. "It's beautiful work, like art. It's just a cradle." "No," she said firmly. "It's more than that. It's love made tangible. Hope carved in wood. She looked up at him, tears threatening. Would you finish it? For this baby. The question hung between them, laden with implications neither of them fully understood yet. Finishing the cradle would mean accepting not just Ivy into his life, but the child she carried. It would mean allowing himself to hope again, to invest emotionally in a future that included the laughter and chaos of children in his home. I'd like that, he said quietly. I'd like to finish it. They spent the morning working together, Ivy holding boards while Jude measured and cut, passing him tools as he fitted joints and sanded rough edges. She had good instincts for woodworking, understanding what he needed often before he asked for it. More importantly, she seemed to grasp the significance of the project, not just as preparation for a baby, but as a symbolic bridge between his past grief and possible future joy. Tell me about them, she said, as he worked on fitting the rockers. Your sons, I mean. If you don't mind talking about them. Jude paused in his work, considering. He hadn't spoken of Thomas and James to anyone in years, not even to Henrik, during his infrequent visits. The memories were too precious and too painful to share casually. But somehow, with Ivy holding the cradle steady while he worked, it felt natural to let the words come. Thomas was the serious one, he said, testing the rocking motion. Even as a little fellow, he'd study everything before trying it. Cautious, thoughtful. He could sit for hours watching birds or chipmunks, just observing how they moved, what they did. Like his father, Ivy observed gently. Maybe. Sarah used to say he had my temperament, but her heart. He'd cry if he saw another child hurt, always trying to fix things for everyone else. Jude adjusted the rockers slightly, perfecting their balance. James was different. Bold as brass from the day he could walk, always climbing something he shouldn't, always ready for adventure. Sarah spent most of her time following him around, keeping him from breaking his neck. He sounds wonderful. He was trouble on legs, Jude said with a slight smile. But the kind of trouble that makes you laugh, even while you're scolding. He had Sarah's smile, could charm his way out of anything with those big green eyes and that innocent expression. They worked in comfortable silence for a while, the rhythm of their collaboration natural, despite having known each other only a few days. As Jude fitted the final pieces and began the careful process of joining them, Ivy prepared lunch and tidied the workshop around them. What about you? He asked, as she swept wood shavings from around his workbench. Did you always want children? Her movement stilled. I used to dream about it when I was younger. A house full of children, a husband who came home each evening, family dinners and bedtime stories. She resumed sweeping, but more slowly. After my parents died, survival became more important than dreams. And after Murdoch, well, I tried not to think about the future at all. And now I'm scared and hopeful at the same time. She set aside the broom and placed both hands on her belly. This baby wasn't conceived in love, but maybe it can still be born into it. Maybe it can have the childhood I dreamed about, even if the circumstances aren't what I once imagined. The honesty in her voice moved him. Children don't need perfect circumstances. They need people who care about them, who'll protect them and guide them and love them despite their mistakes. You sound like you know something about that. I had good parents. Not wealthy, not educated, but decent people who did their best. They taught me that family isn't just about blood. It's about choice, about commitment, about showing up every day even when it's hard. He tested the cradle's stability, satisfied with the result. This baby will have that, if I have anything to say about it. The simple promise seemed to lift a weight from Ivy's shoulders. Thank you, she whispered, for giving us this chance. As afternoon settled into evening, they worked on preparing the cabin for winter and for the changes coming to their lives. Jude showed Ivy how to bank the fires properly for overnight warmth, how to read the weather signs that would tell them when storms were approaching, how to maintain the various systems that kept them comfortable and safe in their mountain isolation. In return, she shared her knowledge of preserving food, of treating common ailments with herbs and remedies, of managing household resources efficiently. They were beginning to function as a team, each contributing skills and knowledge that complemented the other's abilities. That evening, as they sat by the fire after dinner, Ivy took up some mending, while Jude continued working on small details for the cradle. The domestic scene felt both foreign and familiar. Foreign because he hadn't shared such quiet companionship in 7 years. Familiar because it echoed the peaceful evenings he'd once known with Sarah. "Jude," Ivy said softly, looking up from her sewing. "When we marry, when this becomes official, what will you want people to call me? I mean, should I take your name? Will I be Mrs. Blackwood?" The question caught him off guard. In his focus on the practical aspects of their arrangement, he hadn't considered such details. But the sound of it, Mrs. Blackwood, stirred something unexpected in his chest. "If you want to be," he said. Sarah was proud to be Mrs. Blackwood, said it made her feel like she belonged somewhere, belonged to something larger than just herself. "I'd like that," Ivy said simply. "I've been Morrison for 25 years, but it's not a name that holds good memories anymore. I'd be honored to take yours." As they prepared for sleep, Jude found himself thinking about the strange alchemy of their developing relationship. What had begun as a desperate bargain was evolving into something more complex. Not love, not yet, but genuine partnership based on mutual respect and growing affection. The finished cradle sat in the workshop, waiting for the child who would sleep in it. Tomorrow they would begin the process of making their arrangement legal and permanent. Tonight, for the first time in 7 years, Jude Blackwood fell asleep, planning for a future that included more than just solitary survival. Outside, the first snow of winter began to fall, covering the mountain in a blanket of white that would isolate them from the world below until spring. But inside the warm cabin, two people who had found each other in their separate desperations were learning what it meant to no longer face the winter alone. Winter arrived with a vengeance, transforming the mountain landscape into a world of pristine white silence. Snow fell steadily for 3 days, piling against the cabin walls and bending the pine branches low under its weight. Inside, Jude and Ivy settled into the close quarters that winter imposed, learning the rhythms of shared space during the months when the outside world became largely inaccessible. The isolation that had once felt like imprisonment now carried different implications. Where Jude had previously endured winter's solitude with grim resignation, he now found unexpected pleasure in the enforced intimacy. Ivy moved through his space with increasing familiarity, her presence transforming the cabin from a shelter into something approaching a home. "Tell me about the rifle," she said one evening as they sat by the fire, her hands busy with knitting needles and yarn she'd found in Sarah's sewing basket. Outside, wind howled through the trees, but inside the cabin was warm and bright with lamplight. Jude looked up from the harness he was mending, following her gaze to the weapon mounted above the mantel. "Which rifle?" "The old one with the brass fittings. It looks different from the others." He set aside his work and reached up to lift down the weapon in question. It was indeed different, older, more ornate, with intricate engravings along the barrel and stock. The brass was tarnished with age, but still caught the firelight, and the wood bore the patina that came only from decades of careful handling. "This was my father's rifle," he said, settling back into his chair with the weapon across his knees. "And his father's before him. Brought it west from Virginia in 1823 when they decided to try their luck in the territories." Ivy set down her knitting to examine the rifle more closely. "The engravings are beautiful. What do they say?" "Family name, dates, places of importance." He traced the delicate scrollwork with one finger. "See here? Blackwood, 1801. That's when my grandfather first got it. And here, Cumberland Gap, 1823. That's where they crossed into the territories. And this," she pointed to a more recent edition, the engraving still bright compared to the older marks. "Antietam, 1862. Jude read quietly. "I added that one myself, after I got home from the war." A silence settled between them, heavy with unspoken questions. Ivy seemed to sense that she'd touched on something significant, something that went deeper than simple family history. "You fought in the war," she said finally. It wasn't a question. 3 years. Joined up in 61, came home in 64. He hefted the rifle, checking its balance automatically. "This old gun saw more action than any weapon ought to. Saved my life more times than I can count. You don't talk about it much. Most men don't who were there. Too much to say, too little of it good." He looked up to meet her eyes. "But if we're going to be married, if we're going to build a life together, you should know something about the man you're binding yourself to." "I'm listening." Jude leaned the rifle against his chair and stared into the fire, gathering his thoughts. "I wasn't the same man when I came home that I was when I left. The war, it changes you, strips away illusions about what people are capable of doing to each other. I saw good men die for bad reasons, bad men survive when better ones didn't. I did things I'm not proud of, and I failed to do things I should have." "Like what?" "Like stopping some of the worst excesses. Like speaking up when officers made decisions that got men killed unnecessarily. Like staying human when everything around me was pushing towards something else." He was quiet for a long moment. Sarah understood somehow. She helped me remember who I'd been before, helped me find my way back to something resembling peace. And after she died, I stopped trying to be human. Easier that way, less painful to just exist without feeling too much, without caring too much about what happened next. He picked up the rifle again, his hands moving over it with practiced familiarity. "But then you knocked on my door, and suddenly I had to start caring again, whether I wanted to or not." Ivy resumed her knitting, the needles clicking softly in the quiet cabin. "What kind of soldier were you?" "The kind who came home." It was a standard answer, one that deflected deeper inquiry. But she wasn't satisfied with deflection. "That's not what I mean, and you know it." He studied her face in the firelight, seeing the same directness that had characterized her from their first meeting. "I was good at it," he said finally. "Too good, maybe. I could shoot straight, think fast, make hard decisions when other men hesitated. My company commander used to say I had a talent for reading terrain and predicting what the enemy would do next. Leadership, mostly. Just survival instincts and stubborn refusal to quit when things got bad." He stood and returned the rifle to its place above the mantel. "The point is, if Murdoch comes looking for you, and he will, he won't be dealing with just a simple mountain trapper. He'll be dealing with someone who's seen what men can do when they're truly committed to violence. Are you trying to reassure me or warn me? Both, maybe. You should know what you're getting into, what kind of protection I can provide, and what it might cost." That night, as they settled into their separate sleeping arrangements, she by the fire, he in the bedroom, Jude found himself thinking about the conversations they'd been having. Each evening brought new revelations, new layers of understanding about the person fate had brought to his door. Avie was proving to be far more complex than he'd initially realized, with depths of experience and wisdom that belied her youth. More surprisingly, he found himself looking forward to these evening talks, to the gradual process of revealing themselves to each other. It wasn't romance, exactly, too practical for that, too rooted in necessity rather than passion, but it was genuine connection, the slow building of trust and understanding between two people who had chosen to tie their fates together. The next morning brought a break in the weather, and with it the need to venture outside for essential tasks. Jude spent the morning clearing snow from the roof and checking on the animals, while Ivy managed the household tasks that kept them comfortable and well-fed. They worked with the easy coordination of people accustomed to shared labor, each anticipating the other's needs and movements. "The snow's too deep for travel yet," Jude said over lunch, "but in a week or two we should be able to make it down to Willow Creek. Get word to the preacher, maybe pick up some supplies." "What about Murdoch? If he's looking for me, he won't expect you to be traveling with a husband. And Willow Creek's not his territory. Different county, different jurisdiction. Should be safe enough for a quick trip." They spent the afternoon planning for the journey, making lists of needed supplies and discussing how to present their situation to the preacher who would perform the ceremony. It felt strange to be planning a wedding with such practical considerations, but somehow it suited them both. Neither was the type for grand romantic gestures. Both appreciated the honest acknowledgement of what they were doing and why. That evening, as wind rattled the windows and snow continued to fall, they settled into their usual routine by the fire. Evie had found Sarah's mending basket and was working on strengthening the seams of one of Jude's shirts, while he carved small toys, a horse, a bird, a simple doll, for the child who would soon share their lives. "Jude," she said softly, not looking up from her sewing, "can I ask you something personal? More personal than asking me to marry you and raise another man's child?" She smiled at that. "Fair point. I was wondering, do you think you could love this baby? Really love it, not just care for it out of obligation?" The question caught him off guard with its directness. He set down his carving and considered his answer carefully. "I don't know," he said finally. "I loved my sons from the moment I first held them, but they were mine from the beginning. This is different." But he paused, searching for the right words. "I think love sometimes grows differently than we expect. Maybe it starts with choice, with the decision to protect and provide, and grows into something deeper over time. And if it doesn't, if you can never feel that way about a child that isn't yours biologically, then I'll still keep my promises. I'll still be the best father I can be, still give that child every advantage and opportunity I can provide." Sometimes that's enough. Sometimes that's more than enough. The honesty of his answer seemed to satisfy her. They returned to their work, but the comfortable silence between them felt different somehow, deeper, more trusting. They were moving beyond the practical negotiations of their arrangement into something that resembled genuine partnership. Outside, the storm continued to rage, but inside the small cabin, two people who had found each other in their separate desperations continued the slow process of becoming a family. It wasn't the passionate romance of fairy tales, but it was real and solid and built on foundations that could weather whatever storms lay ahead. As Jude finished carving the small wooden horse and held it up to catch the firelight, he realized that for the first time in 7 years, he was creating something meant to bring joy rather than simply serve necessity. The thought filled him with a cautious hope that perhaps the best parts of himself weren't as dead as he'd believed. Perhaps they were simply waiting for the right circumstances to come back to life. Spring arrived with the sound of melting snow dripping from the cabin's eaves and the first tentative songs of returning birds. The world beyond their windows began to emerge from winter's grip, revealing patches of brown earth where the sun struck most directly. Evie's pregnancy had progressed considerably during their months of isolation. She was visibly larger now, moving with the careful grace of a woman carrying precious cargo. The change of season brought practical considerations. Soon, they would be able to travel to Willow Creek for their wedding. But first there were preparations to make and decisions to finalize about their future together. More importantly, there were conversations to have about things they'd avoided discussing during the long winter months. Jude was splitting kindling when the postrider arrived, the first outside contact they'd had since the snows began. Hendrik had sent word through the territorial mail system, a letter that had taken months to reach them through the winter postal delays. Jude tore open the envelope with curiosity, expecting news about spring fur prices or gossip from the settlements below. Instead, he found a letter that changed everything. "What is it?" Ivy asked, noting his expression as he read. She was preparing the midday meal, her movements now requiring careful attention to balance and reach. "A letter from my brother." Jude sank into his chair, the paper trembling slightly in his hands. "From California. I haven't heard from Wesley it must be 8 years. What does he say?" Jude read aloud, his voice catching slightly on the familiar handwriting. "Dear Jude, I hope this letter finds you well, and that the years have been kinder to you than they were when we last corresponded. I know we parted on difficult terms after Sarah's funeral, and I've regretted my harsh words ever since. A man shouldn't let pride keep him from family, and I've been a fool to wait so long to reach out." He paused, looking up to meet Ivy's patient gaze. "We had words after the funeral. He thought I was wallowing in grief, that I should leave the mountain and come west with him. I thought he didn't understand what I'd lost. "Keep reading," she said gently. "I'm writing because my circumstances have changed considerably. The land speculation business has been good to me, better than I ever hoped when I left Montana. I own considerable property now in the Sacramento Valley, good farmland that needs experienced hands to work it properly. I'm getting older, Jude, and I have no sons to pass this on to. I keep thinking about the skills Father taught us, the way we used to work together before the war changed everything." Jude set down the letter and stared into the fire. "He's offering me a partnership, half ownership in his holdings if I'll come west and help him manage the operation. That's a generous offer." "It is. Wesley always was good with money, good at seeing opportunities others missed. If he says the land is valuable, it probably is." He picked up the letter again, scanning the remaining paragraphs. "He mentions wanting to reconcile, wanting to be family again before it's too late." Ivy moved carefully to the table, lowering herself into the chair across from him. "What are you thinking?" "I'm thinking about choices," Jude said slowly. "About the life we could have here versus the life we might have there. About what kind of future we want to build for your child." "Our child," she corrected softly. The words hit him with unexpected force. Somewhere during the long winter months, without conscious decision, he had begun thinking of the baby as his responsibility, his family. When exactly that shift had occurred, he couldn't say, but it was complete now. "Our child," he agreed. What kind of opportunities would California offer that this place couldn't? More people, more opportunities for education, medical care during the birth. She placed a hand on her swollen belly. But also more questions about our sudden marriage, more chance of running into people who might know about my past with Murdoch. "Wesley doesn't know about you yet. This letter was written months ago before you arrived." They spent the afternoon discussing the implications of Wesley's offer. California represented safety from Murdoch's pursuit, economic opportunity, and the chance for Jude to reconcile with his only remaining family. But it also meant leaving the mountain that had been his refuge, abandoning the life he'd built here, giving up the independence that had sustained him through his darkest years. "There's something else to consider," Ivy said as they prepared dinner. "If we're going to California, we should probably do it soon. Travel will become more difficult as my pregnancy progresses, and impossible once the baby's born. You'd be willing to make such a journey? In your condition?" "I've made harder journeys for worse reasons." She stirred the pot thoughtfully. "Besides, starting fresh somewhere new might be better for all of us. Here you'll always be the widower who lost his family. There we could just be the Blackwoods, building our lives together." That evening they sat longer by the fire than usual, each lost in thoughts about the future. The letter from Wesley lay on the table between them, its contents having shifted the entire foundation of their planning. "Tell me about your brother," Ivy said finally. "What kind of man is he?" "Younger than me by 4 years, but always acted older. More ambitious, more willing to take risks. He left home when I was still farming with Father, went west to seek his fortune." Jude smiled slightly. "Used to write letters full of grand plans and bigger dreams. Looks like some of them worked out. Were you close?" "Before the war, yes. Afterward, well, he didn't understand why I couldn't just move on from losing Sarah and the boys. He kept pushing me to remarry, to leave the mountain, to stop living in the past. Maybe he was right, maybe he was. But I wasn't ready to hear it then." He looked at her directly. "I might be now. What does that mean?" "It means maybe we should write back. Tell him about you, about our situation. See if his offer still stands for a married couple with a child on the way." Hope flickered in her eyes. "You're serious about this?" "I'm serious about building the best life possible for our family. If that means swallowing my pride and asking my brother for help, then that's what I'll do." They spent the next hour composing their response, crafting careful words that explained their circumstances without revealing too much about Ivy's past. Jude wrote about meeting and marrying a woman who had lost her family and needed protection. About the child they were expecting together. about his readiness to leave the mountain and start fresh elsewhere. Should we mention Murdoch? Ivy asked as he sealed the letter. Not directly, but I'll write separately to Henrik. Ask him to keep an ear out for any strangers asking questions about us. If Murdoch shows up looking, Henrik can send word to California, and if he finds us before we can leave. Jude's expression hardened. Then we'll deal with that when it happens. But I'd rather face that problem as your husband than your host. The next morning brought the sound they'd been waiting for, the crack and rumble of ice breaking up in the stream that ran past their cabin. Spring was truly arriving, which meant travel would soon be possible again. How long before we can make it to Willow Creek? Ivy asked, watching the water rush past, freed from winter's grip. 2 weeks, maybe less if the weather holds. We'll need to time it right. Get married, send the letter to Wesley, and be ready to travel quickly if his response is favorable. And if it's not, then we make our life here as planned. Either way, we move forward together. That afternoon, as they walked the perimeter of his property, checking fences, assessing winter damage, planning for spring planting, Jude found himself seeing the place with different eyes. Instead of his eternal refuge, it now looked like a chapter in his story, rather than its final page. Do you think you'll miss it? Ivy asked, following his gaze across the meadow where wildflowers were beginning to push through the last patches of snow. Probably. This place has been good to me, even when I wasn't good to myself. But I'm ready for something different now. Ready to be part of the larger world again. Because of the baby? Because of you. Both of you. He took her hand, feeling the calluses she'd developed during their months of shared work. You've reminded me that isolation isn't the same thing as peace. Sometimes you have to risk something to gain something better. That night, as they prepared for sleep, Ivy paused beside the cradle he'd finished. The carved bears and eagles seemed to dance in the lamplight, and the smooth wood gleamed with careful finishing. Whether we stay here or go to California, she said, running her hand along the cradle's edge. This baby will know they're wanted. They'll know they have parents who chose to build a life together, who worked to give them the best future possible. That's all any child can ask for, Jude agreed. That and parents who love them enough to make hard decisions on their behalf. As he banked the fire for the night, Jude reflected on how much had changed since winter's beginning. He'd started the season as a man focused on simple survival. Now he was planning for a future that included not just survival, but prosperity, not just existence, but genuine living. The letter to Wesley would be posted within the week. Their wedding would follow shortly after, and then, whatever came next, they would face it as husband and wife, as partners in building something larger than either could achieve alone. Outside, the mountain stream sang its spring song of renewal and possibility. Inside the warm cabin, two people who had found each other in their separate desperations continued planning for a future that promised more than either had dared hope for when their stories first intersected on that cold October night. Change was coming, as inevitable as spring after winter, and for the first time in years. Jude Blackwood was ready to embrace it. The wedding plans proceeded with quiet efficiency. Jude had sent word to the circuit preacher in Willow Creek, and they'd received confirmation that Reverend Patterson would perform the ceremony on the first Saturday of May. Ivy had altered one of Sarah's better dresses to accommodate her changing figure, and Jude had cleaned and pressed his good suit, the same one he'd worn to his first wedding 16 years earlier. They were preparing for the journey to town, packing supplies and checking the horses, when the sound of approaching riders reached them through the morning stillness. Multiple horses, moving at a steady pace up the mountain trail that led to Jude's cabin. In 7 years of solitude, he'd never had more than one visitor at a time, and never unannounced. "Get inside," he told Ivy quietly, his hand moving instinctively toward his rifle. "Stay away from the windows." She didn't argue, recognizing the change in his demeanor, the subtle shift from peaceful mountain dweller to something harder and more dangerous. As she disappeared into the cabin, Jude positioned himself on the porch, the rifle held casually, but ready. He counted 3 riders as they emerged from the tree line. their horses picking their way carefully up the muddy trail. The man in the lead was tall and broad-shouldered, wearing a sheriff's badge that caught the morning sunlight. Even at a distance, Jude could sense the arrogance in his posture, the way he sat his horse like a man accustomed to having others step aside. Behind him rode two deputies, both younger men with the hard look of those who'd learned violence as a profession. Sheriff Murdoch had finally come calling. "Morning!" Murdoch called out as they approached the cabin, his voice carrying false joviality. "Name's Sheriff Murdoch, Pine Ridge County. Looking for a woman who might have passed through these parts. Young, dark-haired, probably traveling alone." Jude kept his expression neutral, though his grip on the rifle tightened. "Don't get many travelers up here, especially women alone." "What's she wanted for?" "Theft," Murdoch said without hesitation. "Stole money and jewelry from her employer before running off. Dangerous type, known to be unstable, probably armed." The lies came easily to the man's lips, Jude noted. No doubt Sheriff Murdoch had considerable practice in creating justifications for his actions. When would this have been? Jude asked, playing for time while he assessed the threat. 3 armed men, all younger than himself, but he had the advantage of position and intimate knowledge of the terrain. Last October. Trail's gone cold, but we got word she might have headed up into these mountains. "You sure you haven't seen anyone matching that description?" "October," Jude mused as if searching his memory. "That's a long time to be tracking someone over stolen property. Must have been quite valuable." Something flickered in Murdoch's eyes, a flash of anger quickly controlled. "She took something that belonged to me. I don't let that kind of thing go unanswered." The slip was revealing. Not stolen property, something that belonged to him personally. Jude filed the information away while maintaining his facade of helpful neighbor. "Well, Sheriff, I hate to disappoint you, but I haven't seen hide nor hair of any woman up here. Like I said, don't get many visitors at all. You gentlemen are the first I've seen since the snows melted." Murdoch studied Jude's face intently, looking for signs of deception. "Mind if we take a look around? Just to be thorough." "Actually, I do mind." Jude's voice remained calm, but steel entered his tone. "This is private property, and you're outside your jurisdiction. You want to search my place? You'll need a warrant from the territorial marshal. Now see here." "No, you see here." Jude shifted his stance slightly, the movement subtle but unmistakably threatening. "You've got no authority on this mountain, badge or no badge. You've asked your questions and gotten your answers. Time to move along." The 2 deputies' hands drifted toward their weapons, but Murdoch held up a restraining gesture. He was studying Jude with new attention, reassessing the man he'd initially dismissed as a simple mountain hermit. "You military?" he asked suddenly. "Was. Long time ago. Thought so." "You've got that look about you." Murdoch leaned forward in his saddle. "Let me be plain, Mr. Blackwood. Jude Blackwood. Mr. Blackwood, the woman I'm looking for is my property. She belongs to me, and I mean to have her back. If I find out you've been harboring her, lying to a law officer, there'll be consequences." "Is that a threat, Sheriff?" "It's a promise." Murdoch's mask of false civility finally slipped completely. "I know she came this way. Maybe not directly to you, but somewhere up in these mountains. And I'll find her, with or without your help. Then you'd better get started. Lot of territory to cover, and winter's coming again before you know it." The verbal sparring might have continued, but Ivy chose that moment to step onto the porch, her pregnancy obvious even beneath the loose dress she wore. All 3 men's attention snapped to her, and Jude saw Murdoch's eyes narrow as he took in her appearance. "Good morning, gentlemen," she said calmly, moving to stand beside Jude. "I couldn't help but overhear. You're looking for someone?" Murdoch's gaze raked over her face, searching for recognition, but Ivy had changed considerably during her months on the mountain. Her hair was different, her face fuller and healthier than when she'd fled Pine Ridge. Most importantly, she carried herself with the confident bearing of a woman under protection rather than the hunted desperation she'd shown when she first arrived. "My wife," Jude said smoothly, placing a possessive hand on her shoulder. "Ivy, these gentlemen are from Pine Ridge. They're looking for a woman who supposedly stole something." "How terrible," Ivy said with perfect sincerity. "I hope you find her and recover what was taken. Murdoch continued staring at her, suspicion and frustration warring in his expression. "Have we met before, Mom? You look familiar." "I don't believe so. I would remember meeting a sheriff." She smiled politely. "My husband and I keep to ourselves up here. We don't get to town often, especially with the baby coming." "Congratulations," Murdoch said flatly, his attention shifting between Ivy and Jude. "When's the happy event?" "Soon," Jude answered before Ivy could speak. "Which is why we'd appreciate it if you gentlemen would state your business and move along. My wife needs her rest." The standoff stretched taut between them, 3 armed men against 1, but Jude held all the advantages of position, preparation, and moral certainty. More importantly, he'd read Murdoch correctly. The man was a bully who preferred easy targets to genuine fights. "Well," Murdoch said finally, straightening in his saddle, "guess we'll be moving on then. But Mr. Blackwood," he fixed Jude with a hard stare, "if you happen to remember anything about visitors last fall, anything at all, you can find me in Pine Ridge. I'd consider it a personal favor if you'd let me know. I'll keep that in mind." Jude replied evenly. The 3 men turned their horses and began the descent down the mountain. But Murdoch looked back once, his gaze lingering on Ivy's face as if memorizing her features. When they finally disappeared into the trees, Jude and Ivy remained frozen on the porch for several minutes, listening to the fading sound of hoofbeats. "He knows," Ivy whispered finally, her composure cracking. "He knows it's me, he suspects, but he can't prove anything, and he can't act on suspicion alone." Jude guided her back inside the cabin, his mind already working through the implications of Murdoch's visit. "The question is what he'll do next. He'll be back, with more men probably. And next time he won't be so polite about searching the place. Maybe, or maybe he'll try a different approach." Jude moved to the window, watching the trail where the riders had disappeared. Men like Murdoch don't like being challenged in front of their subordinates. His authority took a hit today, and he'll want to restore it. What kind of different approach? The kind that doesn't involve warrants or jurisdiction or playing by rules. Jude turned from the window, his expression grim. "We need to accelerate our timeline. Get married this week, send that letter to Wesley, and be ready to leave for California immediately if necessary. And if he comes back before then?" Jude's hand moved to his father's rifle, hanging above the mantel. The brass fittings seemed to gleam with renewed purpose, and the weapon itself felt heavier with the weight of family legacy and protective responsibility. "Then we'll be ready for him." That afternoon, they worked with quiet intensity to prepare for multiple contingencies. Jude cleaned and checked all his weapons, ensuring they were loaded and easily accessible. He showed Ivy how to use his shotgun, a simple weapon that didn't require precision marksmanship, and positioned spare ammunition throughout the cabin. More importantly, they planned escape routes and hiding places. If Murdoch returned with overwhelming force, they needed options beyond direct confrontation. "There's a cave system about 2 miles north," Jude explained, sketching a rough map. "Natural formation, multiple entrances, easy to defend but hard to assault. I've got supplies cached there, food, blankets, ammunition. If things go bad here, that's where we go." "What about the horses?" "There's a back trail that leads to the cave, follows the ridgeline, where it can't be seen from the main path. We could get there even if they're watching the front approaches." As evening fell, they made their final preparations for the journey to Willow Creek, now scheduled for the next morning instead of the weekend. Every hour they delayed increased the risk that Murdoch would return with reinforcements and fewer scruples about legal niceties. "Jude," Ivy said as they prepared for what might be their last night in the cabin, "I'm sorry. I've brought this danger to your door, disrupted your peaceful life. Don't apologize for surviving," he replied firmly. "And don't apologize for giving me a reason to start living again instead of just existing." That night, as they lay in their separate beds with loaded weapons within easy reach, both knew their quiet mountain idyll was ending. The outside world had found them, brought violence and complication back into their carefully constructed refuge, but they also knew something else. They would face whatever came together as partners, as husband and wife. as two people who had chosen each other against long odds and dangerous circumstances. The tarnished and blood-stained badge that represented Murdoch's corrupt authority had been revealed at last. Now they would discover what their own commitment to each other was truly worth when tested by fire and fear. Outside, the mountain night was still and peaceful, but inside the cabin, two people prepared for war. They left for Willow Creek before dawn, traveling the back trails that Jude knew would keep them hidden from casual observation. Ivy rode Sarah's old mare, a gentle animal that could handle the mountain paths despite her rider's condition, while Jude led the way on his sturdy gelding, constantly scanning their surroundings for signs of surveillance. The journey took most of the day, but they reached Willow Creek without incident. The small town bustled with the activity of spring, merchants restocking after winter, farmers preparing for planting season, families emerging from months of isolation to conduct business and socialize. To any casual observer, they were simply another frontier couple come to town for supplies and perhaps a wedding. Reverend Patterson proved to be a practical man in his 60s, weathered by years of serving scattered communities across the territory. He asked few questions about their circumstances, accepting Jude's explanation that they were mountain folk who preferred privacy and wanted a simple ceremony. The legal documentation was straightforward: names, ages, witnesses drawn from townspeople willing to serve the function. Do you, Jude Blackwood, take this woman to be your lawfully wedded wife, to have and to hold, in sickness and in health, for richer or poorer, as long as you both shall live? I do. Do you, Ivy Morrison, take this man to be your lawfully wedded husband, to have and to hold, in sickness and in health, for richer or poorer, as long as you both shall live? I do. The rings were simple gold bands purchased from the town's jeweler, nothing elaborate but solid and well made. As Jude slipped the ring onto Ivy's finger, he was struck by the weight of the moment. What had begun as a practical arrangement had evolved into something deeper. Though neither of them had spoken of love aloud, by the power vested in me by the territory of Montana, I now pronounce you husband and wife. You may kiss your bride. The kiss was gentle, respectful, the seal on a partnership rather than a passionate declaration. But it was real and binding, and it made Ivy legally his to protect under every law that mattered. As they prepared to leave town, Jude made several critical preparations. He sent the letter to his brother Wesley, now updated to include news of his marriage and their need for sanctuary. He purchased additional ammunition and medical supplies, including items that might be needed during childbirth. Most importantly, he gathered intelligence about any unusual activity in the region. Sheriff Murdoch was through here yesterday, the general store owner mentioned casually as he wrapped their purchases. Had two deputies with him, asking questions about strangers, particularly women traveling alone. Seemed mighty interested in anyone who might have passed through last fall. What kind of questions? Jude asked, keeping his tone conversational. Oh, the usual. Descriptions, timing, destinations. Said he was tracking a criminal, but between you and me... The man leaned closer conspiratorially. Murdoch's got a reputation for stretching the truth when it suits his purposes. Most folks around here don't volunteer much information when he comes calling. The intelligence was both reassuring and worrying. Reassuring because it suggested Murdoch hadn't found any solid leads in town. Worrying because it confirmed he was actively working the area, asking questions that would eventually lead someone to remember the desperate pregnant woman who'd passed through in October. They stayed the night at the town's small hotel, registering as Mr. and Mrs. Blackwood for the first time. The simple act of signing the register together felt momentous, a public declaration of their new status. That evening, as they shared a meal in the hotel's dining room, they discussed their next moves with the careful planning of people whose lives might depend on making the right decisions. How long before we could reasonably expect a response from Wesley? Ivy asked, cutting her steak with the deliberate movements of someone whose expanding belly made simple tasks more complex. 6 weeks minimum, probably closer to 8. Mail service to California isn't fast, and he'll need time to arrange things on his end if he agrees to our coming. And how long before Murdoch figures out who I am? Hard to say. He suspects already, but proving it is different. If he's smart, and I think he is, he'll investigate quietly before making his move. Men in his position don't like to be wrong in public. What would you do if you were him? Jude considered the question carefully. I'd send someone back to Pine Ridge to get a better description of the woman who disappeared. Maybe find someone who knew her well, could identify her despite the changes. Then I'd wait and watch, looking for the right opportunity to act without risking exposure. Someone like Mrs. Hartman, the woman who ran the boarding house. She knew me well enough to recognize me even now. Ivy's fork paused halfway to her mouth. If Murdoch brings her up here, then we'll know we're out of time. Jude reached across the table to cover her hand with his. But until then, we prepare for every possibility and hope for the best outcome. That night, sharing a hotel room bed for the first time, they maintained the respectful distance that had characterized their relationship from the beginning. But there was comfort in the proximity, in the knowledge that they were no longer facing their challenges alone. When Ivy woke from a nightmare about Murdoch finding them, Jude was there to offer quiet reassurance until she fell back to sleep. The return journey to the cabin took them along different trails, routes that would reveal if they were being followed or watched. Jude's military training served them well. He knew how to vary their pace and direction to make tracking difficult, how to use natural terrain to mask their movements, how to identify the signs of surveillance. They saw no evidence of pursuit, but both remained tense until they were safely back within the cabin's familiar walls. Now what? Ivy asked as they unpacked their supplies and settled back into their mountain routine. Now we wait and prepare, Jude said, and hope Wesley responds quickly with good news. The next few days established a new rhythm of vigilance and normalcy. During daylight hours, they maintained their regular activities, tending the garden, caring for the animals, working on projects around the cabin. But weapons were always within reach, and at least one of them was constantly alert for sounds of approaching visitors. Evenings were spent in detailed planning. Jude sketched maps of the surrounding terrain, marking escape routes and defensive positions. They cached supplies at strategic locations, food, ammunition, medical supplies, so they could survive away from the cabin if necessary. He taught Ivy to recognize the sounds of different numbers of horses, to distinguish between casual travelers and purposeful pursuit. The cave system I mentioned, he said one evening, as they studied his maps by lamplight, it's not just a hiding place, it's a fortress, if you know how to use it properly. Multiple entrances and exits, natural choke points where a few defenders can hold off larger numbers. You're talking about a siege. I'm talking about survival. If Murdoch comes back with enough men, we can't fight them in the open. But we don't have to. Make them come to us on ground of our choosing, where their numbers don't matter as much. As Ivy's pregnancy progressed, adding urgency to their planning, they discovered a deepening of their personal connection as well. The shared danger, the mutual dependence, the simple act of facing uncertainty together, all of it contributed to a bond that transcended their original practical arrangement. One evening, as Ivy mended clothes by the fire while Jude cleaned his weapons, she looked up from her work to study his face in the lamplight. "Jude," she said softly, "can I ask you something?" "Always. Do you regret it?" "Marrying me, I mean. Taking on all this trouble and danger when you could have continued living peacefully alone?" He set down the rifle he'd been cleaning and looked at her directly. "Not for a single moment. You've given me back something I thought I'd lost forever." "What's that?" "Purpose. The feeling that what I do matters, that someone depends on me for more than just survival." He paused, choosing his words carefully. "I loved Sarah with everything I had, and when she died, I thought that part of me died too. But what I'm feeling for you, it's different, but it's real, and it's growing stronger every day." Color rose in her cheeks, but she held his gaze steadily. "I feel the same way. This wasn't supposed to be about love, but somehow it became about love anyway." She nodded, tears threatening. "I never thought I could feel this way about anyone after what Murdoch did to me. I thought I was broken in that regard. You're not broken. Hurt maybe, but not broken. And even hurt things can heal, given time and the right circumstances. It was the closest they'd come to declaring their feelings openly, and the moment felt significant despite its quietness. They were no longer simply partners in survival. They were becoming genuinely committed to each other. For reasons that had nothing to do with their original practical arrangement, the revelation added new weight to their preparations for conflict. They weren't just protecting a marriage of convenience anymore. They were protecting something precious and real, something worth fighting for. 3 weeks after their wedding, the letter arrived. Henrik brought it personally, riding up the mountain with news that changed everything. Wesley's response was enthusiastic and welcoming. Yes, there was room for a married couple and child in his California operation. Yes, he could arrange transportation and housing. And yes, he was eager to reconcile with his brother after too many years of separation. But Henrik brought other news as well. Darker intelligence gathered from his contacts in the settlements below. Murdoch's been busy, he reported over coffee and breakfast. Had a woman up from Pine Ridge last week, asking questions all over Willow Creek and the surrounding area. Older woman claimed to be looking for her missing niece. But folks who heard her talking said she was asking mighty specific questions about pregnant women and recent weddings. Jude and Ivy exchanged a look of understanding. Mrs. Hartman had been brought north to identify her, just as they'd feared. How much time do you think we have? Ivy asked. Not much, Henrik admitted. Word is, Murdoch's gathering men from 3 counties, claiming he's got evidence of a kidnapping and needs to mount a rescue operation. Could be here as early as tomorrow, probably no later than the day after. The artifact that would define their immediate future lay on the table between them. Wesley's letter, representing hope and salvation, but also the possibility that help had come too late. California beckoned, but first they would have to survive the next few days. Then we'd better finish our preparations, Jude said grimly. It looks like we're going to need them. Outside, storm clouds were gathering over the mountain peaks, and the wind carried the scent of rain and change. Inside the cabin, 2 people who had found love in the most unlikely circumstances prepared to fight for the right to keep it. The war for their future was about to begin. They came at dawn, 8 riders materializing from the morning mist like harbingers of violence. Jude had positioned himself in the loft window before first light, his father's rifle loaded and ready, while Ivy crouched behind the overturned table they'd arranged as a defensive barrier. Around her neck hung Sarah's silver locket, a talisman of protection and blessing that Jude had given her the night before. Remember, he whispered down to her, if they breach the cabin, you go out the back window and head for the cave. Don't wait for me, don't look back. Just run. I'm not leaving you, she whispered back, her hand gripping the shotgun he'd taught her to use. You're not leaving me. You're protecting our child, our future. That's what matters most. Sheriff Murdoch rode at the head of his makeshift posse, his badge catching the early sunlight like a malevolent star. Behind him came his 2 regular deputies, followed by 5 additional men, bounty hunters by the look of them. Hard cases who'd kill for money without asking too many questions about the law. They stopped just outside rifle range, Murdoch raising his hand to halt the group while he surveyed the cabin and its approaches. Even at this distance, Jude could see the man's calculating intelligence at work, assessing angles of attack and potential defensive positions. Blackwood. Murdoch's voice carried easily across the meadow. I know she's in there. Send her out now and nobody gets hurt. Go to hell, Jude shouted back. You've got no authority here. I've got all the authority I need. Murdoch gestured toward his men. That woman stole my property and kidnapped my unborn child. I'm here to recover what belongs to me. The legal fiction was carefully constructed, Jude realized. By claiming Ivy had kidnapped her own child, Murdoch could justify almost any level of violence in its rescue. The men riding with him probably believed they were participating in a legitimate law enforcement action. The woman in there is my wife, Jude called back. Legally married, carrying my child. You've got no claim on her. Marriage to a kidnapper doesn't make the crime legal. Murdoch's voice carried ugly satisfaction.
Last chance, Blackwood.
Send her out, or we'll come in and get her. Then you'd better bring more men. The standoff stretched taut for several heartbeats. Then Murdoch raised his arm and brought it down in a chopping motion. The attack began. 3 men spurred their horses toward the cabin's front, while 2 more circled toward the back. The remaining 3 dismounted and took positions behind trees and rocks. Their rifles trained on the windows to provide covering fire. Jude's first shot took down the lead rider, the man tumbling from his saddle with a cry of pain and surprise. His father's rifle spoke again, dropping one of the horses and sending its rider scrambling for cover. The military training he'd tried to forget came flooding back. Breath control, target selection, the cold calculation of battlefield mathematics. Below him, Ivy's shotgun boomed as one of the flanking riders tried to reach the back of the cabin. The wide spread of buckshot caught both horse and man, sending them crashing to the ground in a tangle of pain and confusion. "Good shot!" Jude called down, already working the bolt of his rifle to chamber another round. The attackers had expected to overwhelm a simple mountain trapper, but they were discovering their error. Jude's defensive preparations turned their advantages into liabilities. The narrow approaches he'd cleared gave them limited cover, while his elevated position in the loft provided excellent fields of fire. Murdoch, taking cover behind a boulder, began shouting orders to coordinate his men's assault. But the careful discipline of his posse was breaking down under accurate fire from an enemy who clearly knew what he was doing. "Johnson, circle wide left. Martinez, keep his head down. Davidson, get to that window." But Johnson was already wounded from Jude's second shot. Martinez was pinned behind inadequate cover, and Davidson's attempt to reach the cabin ended when Ivy's shotgun spoke again from a different window. The silver locket around her neck caught the light as she moved, Sarah's blessing seeming to guide her actions. She wasn't just defending herself anymore. She was protecting the family she and Jude were building together, the future they'd chosen to fight for. "They're pulling back," she called up to Jude as the surviving attackers retreated to better positions. "First wave," Jude replied grimly, reloading with practiced efficiency. "They'll regroup and try something different." Indeed, Murdoch was already adapting his tactics. 2 men began working their way around to positions where they could provide crossfire, while another prepared to make a direct assault on the cabin's most vulnerable point, the front door. "Ivy," Jude called softly, "when I give the word, I want you to slip out the back window and start moving toward the cave. They're going to rush us, and I can't cover all approaches at once. I won't abandon you. You're not abandoning me. You're completing the mission, protecting what matters most." Through the loft window, he could see Murdoch positioning his remaining men for what would likely be a coordinated assault from multiple directions. The sheriff had learned from his initial mistakes and was now applying genuine tactical thinking to the problem. "Now, Ivy. Go now while they're repositioning. Jude, I'll be right behind you. I promise." He heard the soft sound of the window opening, followed by her careful movement across the ground behind the cabin. Good. Whatever happened next, she and the baby would have a chance to escape to the cave system, where they could hide until help arrived, or Murdoch gave up the pursuit. But Jude had no intention of simply running. These men had come to his home, threatened his wife, tried to steal his future. They would pay a price for that presumption, even if he had to collect it alone. The second wave of the assault began with covering fire from 3 directions. Bullets splintering wood and shattering glass as Murdoch's men tried to suppress his defensive fire. Through it all, Sarah's locket gleamed around Ivy's neck as she moved through the forest toward safety, carrying with her not just their child, but the hope of all their tomorrows. The battle for their future had truly begun. The second assault came like a thunderclap. 3 directions of coordinated fire designed to pin Jude down, while Murdoch himself led the final charge toward the cabin door. But the sheriff had underestimated both his opponent's tactical experience and his desperate determination to protect what he'd found worth fighting for. Jude had prepared for this moment, positioning spare weapons throughout the loft and calculating fields of fire with the precision of someone who'd survived similar encounters during the war. As bullets splintered the walls around him, he moved from position to position, his father's rifle speaking with deadly accuracy. The first man through the door never had a chance to raise his weapon. Jude's shot from the loft took him in the chest, sending him sprawling backward into Murdoch, who cursed and shoved the body aside. The narrow doorway became a killing ground, forcing the attackers to advance one at a time into Jude's prepared crossfire. "Burn him out!" Murdoch shouted, his careful tactics abandoned in favor of brute force. "Torch the place!" But as flames began to lick at the cabin's exterior walls, a new sound reached them through the gunfire, a woman's cry of pain echoing from the forest beyond. Ivy's voice, unmistakable in its distress. Jude's blood turned to ice. Labor, the stress and exertion of their escape, had triggered the birth, leaving her vulnerable and alone in the wilderness while he was pinned down by Murdoch's assault. The realization transformed him. Where before he'd fought with professional competence, now he fought with the desperate fury of a man protecting his family. Every shot became personal, every movement calculated not just for survival, but for the speed needed to reach his wife before it was too late. "She's having the baby," he roared down at Murdoch, his voice carrying over the crackling flames and gunfire. "Your child is being born out there while you're trying to murder its father." For a moment, the intensity of fire slackened as Murdoch processed the implications. If the child died because of his assault, he'd lose the very thing he claimed to be trying to save. But his pause lasted only seconds before rage overwhelmed calculation. "Then we'd better finish this quick." Murdoch leveled his pistol toward the loft.
Kill him and find her.
The cabin was burning in earnest now, smoke filling the loft and forcing Jude toward the rear window. But he wasn't retreating. He was positioning himself for one final, desperate gambit. As Murdoch charged up the ladder toward the loft, Jude dropped through the rear window and circled back toward the front of the cabin. The move caught the attackers by surprise. They'd expected him to flee toward the forest, not return to the battle. Jude's rifle cracked twice in rapid succession, dropping the men who'd been providing covering fire. Before he dove behind the woodpile near the cabin's front corner, Murdoch emerged from the burning cabin, his face blackened with smoke and twisted with fury. "Where are you, you bastard? Face me like a man!" "Here." Jude rose from behind the woodpile, his father's rifle trained on the sheriff's chest. "Just you and me now, Murdoch. The way it should be. The remaining deputies had been wounded or killed in the assault. Only the two enemies faced each other across the burning wreckage of Jude's peaceful mountain home, while Ivy's cries of labor pain echoed from the forest beyond. "She belongs to me," Murdoch said, his pistol steady despite the smoke stinging his eyes. "That child belongs to me. I'll kill you and take them both, over my dead body." That's the idea. They fired simultaneously. Murdoch's bullet plowed through the woodpile where Jude had been standing, but the mountain man had already moved, using cover and angles learned in countless skirmishes during the war. His shot took Murdoch in the shoulder, spinning him around and sending his pistol flying, but the sheriff wasn't finished. Drawing a backup weapon with his offhand, he advanced toward Jude's position, blood streaming down his arm. "I'll gut you slow for that. Then I'll take my woman back and teach her what happens to property that tries to run away. She's not your woman." Jude's voice carried absolute certainty as he worked the bolt of his rifle, chambering what might be his final round. "She's my wife, mother of my child, and you'll never touch her again." The final exchange came at close range, too close for either man to miss. Murdoch's pistol barked flame and smoke, the bullet grazing Jude's ribs and spinning him partially around. But even as he fell, Jude's rifle found its mark, the heavy bullet taking Murdoch's center mass and dropping him like a felled tree. Silence settled over the battle scene, broken only by the crackling of flames consuming the cabin and Ivy's increasingly urgent cries from the forest. Jude struggled to his feet, pressing his hand against the blood seeping through his shirt, and staggered toward the sound of her voice. He found her in a small clearing beside the stream, propped against the base of an enormous pine tree. The baby's blanket, the one she'd knitted during their long winter evenings, was spread beneath her, ready to receive new life even as violence raged around them. "Jude," she gasped, sweat beading her forehead despite the cool mountain air. "The baby's coming. Now." He dropped to his knees beside her, his rifle forgotten, his wounds ignored. "I'm here. We're safe now. Everything's going to be fine. Murdoch, dead. It's over." Sarah's silver locket caught the morning light as Ivy bore down with another contraction, bringing their child into a world made safe by violence, but blessed with the promise of love. The baby that emerged into Jude's waiting hands was tiny but perfect, its first cries announcing the victory of life over death, hope over despair, love over violence. "It's a boy," Jude whispered, tears streaming down his face as he wrapped the infant in the blanket Ivy had prepared. "Our son." As he placed the baby in his wife's arms, the morning sun broke through the smoke and chaos, illuminating their small family with golden light. The battle was over, the future was won, and a new chapter of their lives was beginning with the sound of an infant's cries echoing across the peaceful mountains. 3 months later, the California sun painted the Sacramento Valley in shades of gold and green that seemed almost too vibrant after the muted tones of the Montana mountains. Jude sat on the porch of the house Wesley had provided, watching Ivy tend to their vegetable garden while their son, named Thomas Wesley Blackwood, in honor of both his lost brother and his living uncle, slept peacefully in the cradle that had traveled with them. From the mountain cabin, the cradle bore scorch marks from the fire that had consumed their first home, but Jude had repaired and refinished it with loving care during their journey west. It stood now as a bridge between their past and present, holding the child who represented their future. "He's going to be tall like his father," Wesley said, settling into the chair beside Jude with 2 cups of coffee. The years had been kind to Jude's younger brother. Prosperity had given him confidence without arrogance, success without forgetting his roots. "Already got that serious expression you used to wear when you were thinking through a problem. He's a good baby," Jude agreed, his voice carrying the wonder that still surprised him every time he looked at his son. "Quiet, observant. Ivy says he has Sarah's eyes. And what do you say?" "I say he has his own eyes, his own life to live." Jude sipped his coffee, watching his wife work in the garden with the same methodical care she'd brought to every aspect of their new life. "But I see Sarah in him sometimes, in the way he studies the world around him. And I see Ivy in his stubborn streak," Wesley laughed. "Family traits have a way of mixing in interesting combinations. Look at us. Same parents, completely different paths through life. Until now." "Until now," Wesley agreed. "I'm glad you came, Jude. Glad you both came. This place needed family to make it complete." The reconciliation between the brothers had been easier than either had expected. Wesley's prosperity had taught him patience, while Jude's journey from isolation to love had softened the hard edges that had driven them apart. They worked well together, Jude's practical mountain skills complementing Wesley's business acumen in developing the ranch that was becoming one of the valley's most successful operations. The territorial marshal's office sent another letter, Wesley said, producing an envelope from his shirt pocket. "Final report on the Murdoch situation." Jude accepted the letter, but didn't immediately open it. The official investigation into Sheriff Murdoch's death had been thorough, but ultimately favorable to their version of events. Too many people in Pine Ridge had suffered under the corrupt sheriff's authority, and his attack on a legally married couple in their own home had been impossible to justify even under the loosest interpretation of law enforcement duties. "Anything new?" he asked, just confirmation that the case is officially closed. "No charges, no further investigation needed." "You're completely clear." "We're completely clear," Jude corrected. "All of us." That evening, as the sun set over the valley and painted the sky in brilliant oranges and purples, the Blackwood family gathered for dinner in the dining room of their new home. It was a different kind of domestic peace than they'd known in the mountain cabin, more prosperous, more social, with Wesley's frequent visits and the interactions that came with being part of a larger community. But the essential elements remained the same: the quiet satisfaction of shared work, the comfort of routine built around mutual care and respect, the growing love that had surprised them both with its depth and strength. "I've been thinking about names," Ivy said, as she served the meal she'd prepared from vegetables grown in their own garden and meat from their own livestock. "For future children, future children." Jude raised an eyebrow, though his tone carried pleasure rather than surprise. "Well, Thomas needs brothers and sisters to grow up with, and this valley has room for a large family." She smiled, the expression transforming her face with happiness that erased the last shadows of her difficult past. "I was thinking, Sarah, if we have a daughter, to honor the woman whose blessing made our love possible." The suggestion touched something deep in Jude's chest. "She would have liked that. She would have liked you." "I hope so. I hope she would have approved of the life we've built together." After dinner, Jude walked out to the small cemetery plot he'd established on a hill overlooking the ranch. 3 markers stood there now, simple wooden crosses he'd carved himself, bearing the names of Thomas and James Blackwood and Sarah Blackwood, beloved wife and mother. It wasn't where their bodies lay, but it was where their memory lived in his heart. "We made it," he said to the evening air, his words carrying to whoever might be listening beyond the veil of death. "All of us. Different than we planned, but good. Better than good." When he returned to the house, he found Ivy nursing the baby by lamplight, her face serene with contentment. The family Bible lay open on the table beside her, a new one Wesley had given them as a wedding gift, with all their names inscribed in careful script on the family page. Jude Blackwood, married to Sarah Morrison Blackwood, 1864–1871. Jude Blackwood, married to Ivy Morrison Blackwood, 1878. Thomas Wesley Blackwood, born 1879. "What are you reading?" he asked, settling beside her on the sofa. "Psalms, the one about still waters and green pastures." It seemed appropriate. She looked up at him with eyes that held peace he'd never seen during their desperate early days together. "Do you ever miss it? The mountain, the solitude, the simple life we had there?" "Sometimes," he admitted, "but I don't regret leaving. That life was about ending things, mourning the past, waiting to die. This life is about beginning things, building a future, raising a family, being part of something larger than myself. And if you had to choose again, if you could go back to that night when I knocked on your door." Jude looked at his wife, at his sleeping son, at the family Bible that recorded their journey from strangers to family. Outside, the California night was warm and full of promise, so different from the cold mountain evening when their story had begun. "I'd open the door even faster," he said without hesitation, "and I'd say yes to your proposal before you finished asking." Later, as they prepared for bed in the home they'd built together through trial and triumph, Jude reflected on the strange turns that had brought them to this moment of quiet happiness. 2 broken people had found each other in desperation and discovered that sometimes the most unlikely love stories became the most enduring ones. The baby's cradle rocked gently in the corner, its carved bears and eagles standing guard over the child who represented not just their future, but their redemption. Tomorrow would bring new challenges, new opportunities, new chapters in the story they were writing together. But tonight, for the first time in longer than he could remember, Jude Blackwood fell asleep not as a man waiting to die, but as a man grateful to be alive. The family Bible on the nightstand bore witness to their journey from desperation to hope, from survival to love, from 2 separate broken hearts to one unified family ready to face whatever tomorrow might bring. In the end, that was legacy enough for any man, to have loved and been loved in return, to have protected what mattered most, and to have left the world a little better than he'd found it. Some stories, he realized, had happy endings after all.